Welcome to the Conditions for Recovery podcast. I'm George, a specialist pain physiotherapist. In this podcast, we share stories of hope and improvement from real people who have found a way forward, helping you to counteract narratives of inevitable decline. Today's guest is Amber Horrox. For 20 years, Amber minimized her experience with disabling migraine attacks until the complete collapse of her life and health in 2018. That moment led to a profound realization. She needed to stop looking outside of herself for answers and take back the reins of creation for her own health. She has now reached remission. Now she is dedicated to helping others reclaim their lives through her platform, Warrior Within. Amber supports people living with migraine and chronic pain through an ecosystem of offerings, including her blog, her podcast, Your Migraine Story Matters, a community healing circle called the Wellness Maidens, and her writing, which includes her first book, Unleashing My Inner Power, and a second book, which is now available for pre-order. Thank you for joining me today, Amber. So I've already shared a bit of an intro, but it'd be really great if you could let people know what has brought you to this point.
Essentially, throughout my entire adulthood, from around the age of 18, I started experiencing what I can only describe as violent and agonising migraine attacks that would only happen in the middle of the night at the back of my head. I now understand them more to be linked to post-concussion headache. The pain was unimaginable, indescribable. The only belief that I had around it at the time was that I must be dying and that the end must be in near sight. But of course I didn't die, otherwise I wouldn't be here. And really the part of me that did die was the part of me that had no idea that debilitating pain to that level could exist. And yeah, I really kept quite quiet about it for 2 decades. I suffered very much in silence until a kind of downturn in my life just as we were coming into 2015. So my dad had just announced he had an aggressive form of cancer. Me and my partner of 7 years split up. Shortly after that, because of that, I moved to a new city, which was far away from where I had been living and my friends, simply to be nearer to work. Work problems ensued. There was this real tumbling down, and it felt like life was kind of caving in on me in all angles. I missed the opportunity to perhaps do a little bit of a life review and a little bit of a check-in with where I was in life and perhaps what opportunities might lay before me and what I wanted and needed. Completely bypassed all that, overrode all of that. That then led to a period of deep depression. I had been depressed to the point of suicide ideation before, when these violent and agonising attacks first began in the late 90s. And at that time, that's when the migraine attacks that I'd been living with sporadically but nevertheless consistently for those 20 years, that's when they began to take a different turn. They began to increase in frequency and in duration. And within 3 years of that, there was the full collapse of my life. And yeah, so what's brought me from there to here today? A lot of people ask me, what's the one thing, what changed? My whole life, that's what's changed. But through embarking on, say, a journey of exploration, I think sometimes, whilst I identify with the healing side of it, and that has been a very big part of it, the whole healing journey can bring up a lot of things in us. And really it was embarking on the journey of exploration, trying to understand a little bit more about myself and what I was living with and what I'd always been living with, and me being the one to recognise the serious nature of it, the severity of it, how life-limiting and impacting it was myself in the absence of trying to fight for everybody else's attention and for other people to see it and help me. And it was that journey of exploration and opening up to some of the niggles, some of the messages, some of the signs that I was aware they were there, but I was ignoring them. That's really led me to taking back the reins of creation for my own health, my own well-being, my own life. And it didn't resolve everything. It didn't fix everything. It was the long game. I had to adjust in many ways and learn to play a long game. But yeah, it's that journey of exploration and awakening that's really brought me to where I am now.
There's something interesting in the fact that you just suffered in silence for so long, and what role did that play in the eventual spiral that you mentioned before, it often feels like it's a very sudden, maybe one or two things which set off this snowball, but actually there was probably stuff bubbling under the surface for a really long time. And at some point it gets overwhelming and then things begin to really collapse around you. And when you say that you just suffered in silence, was there any times that you were seeking support or help during that period of time?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I did feel like I was doing the right thing. I did feel like I was taking action. I did feel like I was doing what you meant to do. And that was to go and register what was happening with the doctors. I believed that was what I'd been told. You're sick, you're ill, you go to the doctors, they sit with you and help you figure it out and help you, whether that's, through medication or treatment or insight or understanding. I had no clue about that side of things, but my belief was that that's where the help and support lies. So I did that over and over and over again for the 20 years, to a very increased amount in the final 3 years. To no avail. I was told that it wasn't migraine. The reference point I had for migraine and why I knew it was migraine was because as a child I would visit my friend and her mum would be struggling to make dinner for us because she also experienced migraine, and she would ask us to kind of she'd be really suffering, she'd ask us to massage the back of her neck and her head, and me and my friend would take it in turn. So that was the reference point I had for migraine. So that was what I took to the doctors, that it must be. They told me that it wasn't that it couldn't be that it was too difficult to diagnose, and each time I would just get fobbed off. So yeah, that was my attempt, or many attempts. Different doctors, different counties, different locations in England. Didn't matter where I went or how many different people I saw, it was the same response each time.
What do you think was driving that response? Because you were presenting and saying, I'm suffering here and I have some specific symptoms that you can very clearly describe. And then it sounds like people were just saying, no, it's all right, don't worry about it. We're not going to investigate it by the sounds of things. We're not going to give you a clearer answer. We're just going to tell you why it isn't that thing. And in hindsight, is there any reason that you feel that was the approach that was being taken, or was it just that you were being dismissed?
I mean, yes, I was very much being dismissed, gaslighted, but there's a lot of anger that I feel over this, and it's very easy to project blame. And it's not that I don't feel anger and that I don't fall into patterns where I fire a load of blame at them or the system. Through my journey of exploration, I've come to understand it from a deeper insight with a different lens and a different perspective. I can feel tension in my jaw. I feel like, why didn't they help me? They should have done more. They need to change. But when we get to the crux of it, I came to learn a few things. So doctors in particular only receive 4 hours education on headache and migraine. And then when it comes to the neurologists, the specialists, they don't receive much more. My theory, I have a theory, can I share it with you?
Absolutely.
My theory is that as well as being the most common disorder and the most disabling, the number 1 most disabling to women under 50, the second most disabling in the world, it's now actually increasing in men and adolescents. For what is thought to be the first time. It's also the most complex. So it's the most common neurological disease known to man, and it's also the most complex. I've also, as well as kind of researching medically and holistically and the Eastern and the Western approach and the scientific as well as the holistic, I've also been researching psychology just out of my own personal interest over the last kind of 8+ years, and have become fascinated by the complexity of migraine, hormones, health, as well as business. And when it comes to complexity, psychologically we treat it like abandonment and rejection. I don't want to go near that, I don't want to experience that.
Yeah.
And so that's my theory on one of the reasons why there is so little training, there's so little insight and understanding into not just the complexity of migraine either, of course. This ripples out to many different types of chronic illness. And yeah, I think that's something that on a deeper level, when you look beyond the surface and how we feel about it and the problems, and when we look beneath all of that, where some of this journey of exploration has led me.
I think there's two things that I want to revisit. I'll revisit the one that you said more recently first. Your point about abandonment and rejection in complexity is a really core one, because the huge amount of the really unhelpful language that gets used in healthcare interactions is often when somebody's authority is challenged, when somebody is made to feel that they don't have the level of competency that they feel with other things. And things like migraine and fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue syndrome and CRPS, all of those things make an awful lot of healthcare professionals feel deeply uncomfortable because they challenge biases, they challenge training. And the other thing that you said that links into that is that obviously people have their own experiences of having individually dissatisfying, unpleasant, frustrating conversations with healthcare professionals. But I generally believe that this is a system problem. It's that those individuals could be better communicators in that situation. It's something you said before. I was very angry and I felt like they needed to change. I think that the system needs to change. We need to recognize ambiguity and we need to recognize complexity. And rather than that rejection of that gaslighting of that this is a you problem, not a me problem, there's something really key in that, because a huge amount of the dissatisfaction that people with long-term conditions have with healthcare is because communication is broken down, is because that complexity leads to people feeling insufficient, inadequate, or whatever you want to call it. And then there's something interesting about the way that you frame that, because you kind of framed it as, well, I've now learnt that this is down to me, which I think there is that, but that doesn't mean that that conversation with a healthcare professional needs to be so unpleasant and difficult.
Of course, of course.
So to go back to what you said previously, I know that you mentioned before hating the question what changed, because as you say, there's not a single thing. It's presumably that realization that you reached a very significant point in a downward spiral. But how did you begin to start clawing back from that point?
Yeah, now I've understood a lot more about how I was feeling inside and perhaps what was going on in my inner world, and tended to those parts of me that, just felt extremely activated when I was asked those questions. I've now been able to move. I've calmed a lot of the inflammation inside, and found different ways to support myself and bring in the support around me. So I have sat with that question, what did change, on that kind of fateful kind of day or week in 2018, where I eventually realised that this was it. I could no longer drag myself out of bed to go to work in the same way that I had done for the years prior. And it was 4 things, if I can remember them off the top of my head. So one was that I no longer saw anyone in authority as being right over my body and me being wrong. Up until that point, I believed that everyone else was right and I was wrong. Everyone else knew what they were doing. It was only me that was struggling, that kind of thing. So that was one thing that changed. Another thing was that I started asking myself big questions for the first time. What do I need? Bloody hell, I need support. I thought I could do everything on my own, and I can't. I need support. I am desperate for it. I started to connect, like I mentioned, those niggles, those signs, those messages that were there. And I think if we all sit with it, we can look, reflect back these gut instincts that we have, these things that we're aware of, but we might allow somebody else to say, well, no, that's not true. I started listening to those. One of them was that stress is killing me. Chronic stress, overloaded stress, accumulated stress, it was killing me. I'd come across the signs a few times, but I just kind of dismissed it myself in the way that, much in the same way that I was being dismissed medically, in the way that was being reflected back to me. I knew out of nowhere that change was needed. I wrote it in my journal in the middle of the night. I knew that change was needed, and I knew it was going to take me some time. And also, this is from reading back through my journal, as you can imagine, the collapse of my life. And for anyone listening who's experienced that, we do not know what the heck is going on. In my journal, I found these notes that at 2:00 in the morning, I think I'd written them. And one of the notes I'd written was, my health matters, I matter. And I'd never treated myself in the 38 years before this happened. I'd never treated myself like a person or someone who mattered. I'd never considered my health. On the outside, I looked to be a very healthy person. I loved exercise. I gave off the impression to people that I ate well. People were under the impression that I had a lot of energy.
There's a few things in this, and they are actually recurrent themes in almost every conversation that I have with people who have reached a point that you have reached. The first one is that maintaining the status quo doesn't help yourself, and it doesn't help the people in your life. It feels like it's helping the people in your life, but when things eventually do collapse, it's going to have an impact on not only yourself, but also on the way that everyone else expects things. It's that lack of self-compassion, the I don't matter, everyone else matters. And it's having those flexible expectations in yourself. So you said change is needed, but instead of using that as another stick to beat yourself with, you said, I've got to recognize that this is going to take time and it's going to take work. And I think that's such a valuable thing, because we see constant promises of quick fixes, of there being a single approach that's going to help. And actually, your 4 things. 1, I need to start trusting myself. Nobody else is coming to save me. I'm the person. It's a horrible realization, but I think it's brutal but necessary.
Yes.
And then the other thing is this, not just maintaining the status quo, but the maintaining the status quo of stress. People's lives are already stressful enough without them then doing everything that they can to make themselves as stressed as possible, because they have such rigid expectations of themselves. We've in some ways expanded those 4 things, because actually you've gone, well, I realize this thing, but then there's something really valuable in the description of that one thing, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I actually think that that is a much more valuable approach than all you need to do is this modality, or all you need is that treatment approach, or all you need to do is attend this specific strategy or do this specific thing. Because actually this recovery, whatever that means, because it means something different for every individual, but recovery, it's a much more multifaceted process, and it does take time, and there are no shortcuts. And what you've just said really is key. Ultimately, this is saying, well, I need to try and find a way to reduce or remove myself from stress. Like, that's a big thing that takes a lot of time. It's about identifying what those triggers are and then figuring out, how do I find a way to move forward with them? But were there other things that you found were surprising that you found beneficial?
Yeah, I've been writing extensively to try and write a memoir, which has taken me back into that place, which was enormously traumatising, I have to say, because it was a place where everything was caving in on me at all angles until there was nothing left. There was a lot of grief in that year, which I didn't know grief was what I was feeling or experiencing until I saw other fellow chronic illness writers write about it. I knew that it was extremely difficult. My dad had just died. I lost my job, my career, my income. I was being told things like I was selfish, that I didn't know what I was doing, that I was too vulnerable to make decisions regarding my own health. It was a lot. And so to go back into that time was very difficult and quite traumatising. But my belief is something that I think we connect on, George, that it will be that we need change. We need to change. The system needs to change. It all needs to change, and that's a lot too. My belief is that it is in the sharing of our stories that we will start to unearth, unveil, reveal the common denominators between those of us who embark on this journey of exploration, where really we start off with nothing but hope. Though, you know, in those dark days, it was very, very dark. It was very painful, very uncomfortable. And it really felt like all I had was hope. When I look back now, I can see I had more than that. I had belief. My health matters, I matter. I've come to terms with some guiding companions that I've written about in my book that's just become available for pre-order. And those guiding companions are, I learned to drowning out the noise. So I learned how to do that. Tuning into my own inner knowing, like I've shared about the stress was killing me and the change was needed and it was going to take some time. Starting with where I had and working with what I got, not wishing it was any different, not wishing I had any more of this or that or the other, knowing that I did, knowing that I didn't have all that I needed and didn't have support from loved ones and, a home medical team or anything like that. And really learning the art and the practice of doing what I could when I could, which, as we all know, those of us living with chronic illness, is very, very, very limited. It's very minimal, and it really does feel like you're crawling along at snail's pace, if you feel like you're crawling at all. So it was those, as I say, I've come to term them, guiding companions that really helped me get started and get doing something. And I now realise that getting clear on my needs, that first one, like I shared earlier, support being my number one need, really embarking on the journey. What I didn't realise at the time, I became some of that support that I needed, in the absence of it coming from anywhere around me, and that realisation of no one is coming to my rescue. I became some of that support that I needed, and it was from that place I was then able to bring in some of the support surrounding.
That's really interesting, because it goes back to that people aren't coming to save you idea. I often say to people that my role is to provide guidance, it's to be a sounding board, it's to bounce ideas off, and that my experience of both working in this area for a long time but also having personal experience of it means that I am possibly in a good position to help that person to bounce those ideas off. But ultimately, the change always comes from them. My role is to provide support, guidance, and to maybe support someone to organize some of those thoughts, but it's them that's doing all of the work. And what you said before about recognizing that you need to be your own support and you need to feel comfortable in that, and then start looking for those other people and those other things that might provide that support. I think that is a wonderfully helpful idea, because if you don't have that foundational idea happening, then potentially you're still looking for somebody else to fix the problem. And the challenge is that we don't have simple solutions to any of these chronic health conditions. They wouldn't be chronic health conditions if we did have simple solutions. Mm-hmm. A common denominator that comes up over and over and over again is recognizing your own agency. It's going, hang on a minute, I've tried lots of stuff here. People have either tried to support me or not really tried to support me in an adequate way, but I have tried to seek that assistance. And going, what can I do differently, is actually a really massive step. But also grief. You are not only grieving for the fact that once you felt healthy, you're grieving for the life that you used to have. You're grieving for the life that you hoped you'd have. You're also grieving for the idea that somebody can provide you with something which is simple and quick and easy and pain-free that is going to make everything better.
It's massive.
It's huge. And as you say, grief is just over and over and over again a topic that comes up, and yet it's not something that we talk about enough when we're talking about any form of long-term condition management. And I think it is interesting because you're starting to see more of it. I see it pop up on things more frequently. But as you said before, reflecting on these things can be really challenging and can be really triggering. And you were mentioning that you've been journaling for a long time, but it sounds like, I know you don't like the expression, but at some point the dots joined together, something clicked, something fell into place, which made you go, whatever I'm doing at the moment isn't helping. Do you feel that journaling has become, because you referred to it as journaling at one point and now you refer to it as writing, and do you feel that they're on the same spectrum but with different purposes?
Yeah, I describe journaling as a tool that saved my life. I talked about the kind of decline of my mental health to the point of suicide ideation in 2015. I was that way for a long time. And then experienced what can only be described as a breakdown later on in 2016. Came very close to ending it all. And it was at that point where I realised for the first time how big this was, how serious it got. There's a difference between thinking about all the different ways to perhaps end things to then reaching a point where you're actually going to do it. And that was a real, I guess, shock to the system, but also looking back, a massive wake-up call. And I ended up saying to my boyfriend, I need to speak to someone. I am desperate. To which he then miraculously responded, my friend is a counsellor. Do you want me to see if he'll speak to you? And it turned out he was a counsellor for children. These were people that we knew, that we went out with, and I was so desperate. I just didn't care that he knew how much I was struggling, because I think before that I was under this impression that I had to hold it all together and keep it all inside and not let anyone see the cracks. And the first thing that he suggested on session 1 was to journal. And I was in a position where I was experiencing full body pain at that time. So it wasn't just violent and agonising attacks in the head. It was pain in my face, my arms, my legs, all over body pain. And I just thought, you know what, if you're telling me what to do and you're telling me to do this and you believe it's going to help, I'm listening. So I went out the next day and bought a journal, and embossed on it was New Era, not something I was connecting with at the time. But I started to write down in there, looking back, I wrote down quotes. I was sitting and listening to TED Talks at work on a lunchtime to try and keep myself sane, making notes from those TED Talks. I was creating new affirmations for myself that were basically the script in my head. I flipped them, and I didn't believe what I was saying. Of course not. My body was familiar with me telling myself I was struggling and not coping, and I was struggling and not coping. It was true. But I flipped them and started saying, you know, I have a good life. I'm surrounded by people where I'm supported. This kind of thing. So I use my journal very much for that, and I describe it as a tool that saved my life. Unbeknown to me, I was also writing and connecting with insights that somewhere within me internally I was aware of, but mentally they weren't kind of connecting. So yeah, it was very much a tool that saved my life, and now I do see myself as a writer. So I've published the one book, the ebook that you mentioned, The Unleashing My Inner Power. I'm just in the process of publishing book 2. Book 2 has turned into 2 books, so the third book is already there, written, ready to come. I've got another book coming on menstrual health. So that's how that journey has evolved and grown. And I'm no longer in a place where I need this to survive. I use writing as a tool to thrive.
I wanted to return to something that you said before about flipping the script even when you don't believe the thing that you're saying. I sometimes feel that some of the things that we ask people to do in pain management, you might feel silly, you might feel like an idiot doing what I'm asking you to do. It's the very graded exposure to forms of movement that might be relaxing and helpful in the long term, as an example. And I often say to people, why don't you go and try this thing? And I want you to go for almost no time at all and do something that feels so negligibly easy that it doesn't feel like you're doing anything. And that really goes against what people want to be seen to be doing something meaningful. And it's a broken idea that we are only doing beneficial things if they look beneficial. And would you say that over time of flipping that script, writing things down or saying messages to yourself that had previously not made sense to you, did that over time embed? Did that over time change the way that you were thinking about things?
Yeah, so going back to the affirmations and completely flipping that script, I didn't believe it every day when I was walking across the bridge, but unfortunately I'd been spending my days walking across the bridge thinking about throwing myself off it. So when I flipped the script, it was something to replace that and something to guide me as I walked along the bridge and move me away from wanting to do that or thinking about that. I think connection was the key, really, because somewhere in me, I believed that the doctors were there to help me and that they would help me get to the root of the cause and that together we would pave a pathway to wellness. That belief was in me, but it was dormant. I was disconnected from it. And it was a way to help me reconnect, I think, to the beliefs and the truth of it. So, yeah, it only took 10 days for that shift, and then I just continued on with it and kind of deepened it.
There's something to this, because you mentioned before the bringing in support from elsewhere, having that support network. There's always somebody in a previous episode said, when asked, do you have anything else you'd really like to say? They said, oh, my person who really supported me to begin turning my life around was Dr. Joe Blogs. I can't remember their name off the top of my head. And then the next person that came on said, yeah, I've got Dr. Joe Blogs as well. And it's interesting what you said before, that actually you had to relearn that with the right interactions in healthcare, there is a chance sometimes when we're saying this is about me, that then becomes all about you. And actually your support network does become incredibly helpful. And that support network can be clinicians as well as loved ones, as well as colleagues. And that relationship with healthcare improved as well. Is that accurate?
So that it did have an impact. So what happened was I was misdiagnosed with tension headache for 3 years. So I went to the doctors for 17 years saying it was migraine. Then kind of, various parts of my life started kind of caving in at all angles, and I ended up very, very, very depressed. And the attacks then increased in frequency and in duration. And I had nothing in me left to say to the doctors when I got there that it was migraine, so I stopped saying it was migraine, and that was then when I was misdiagnosed with tension headache. And I was, bearing in mind, I couldn't sit up in the waiting room. I couldn't sit up. I had to lie down on the chairs. I was struggling every single day, all day, not having the right words to articulate and communicate any of this to them. And then, like you say, no kind of further investigative or exploratory work was taking place. So I was misdiagnosed with tension headache for 3 years, but alongside this, experienced my breakdown, brought in the initial support of a counsellor and some of the practices that, really helped me, save my own life. I've been researching but not really aware of it, kind of unconsciously, little bits here and there, but this was where my research really began, or in a conscious manner anyway. I started then researching tension headaches, and it said you can function. It's an ache in the head, it only lasts this long. There's no other symptoms. So then I went to the doctor and said, look, I've been diagnosed with tension headache. I've been researching tension headache. It says here that you can function through tension headache. I can't function. And that's when she went, it's migraine. And I said, but I've been saying this for all these years. And then I kept going back to see her and insisting to see a specialist. This didn't register or compute at the time. It was later on reflection when I looked back. She said, I can refer to you, but they're not sympathetic to migraine. Well, that didn't mean anything to me. I didn't need someone's sympathy. I needed to be believed. I needed help. I needed support. I needed understanding. I don't need your sympathy. I was struggling enormously, and that kind of didn't register. I didn't know what that meant. I still had this belief that, when I get there, they're going to help me. They're going to help me get to the root of the cause. We're going to pave this pathway to wellness together. It'll all be right. And then I got there, and it was true. They weren't sympathetic to migraine. It's also true that I did learn some things about migraine that I didn't know before. I didn't know at that point it was one of the world's most disabling diseases. And when the neurologist shared that with me, I said, I didn't know that, but that's exactly how I feel. He also informed me about my medication overuse, and I was taking 7 sumatriptans per attack. I knew I was experiencing 2 72-hour pain element only versions of the attack at the severe end of the scale twice a week. So I was 6 days bedbound by the time I was permitted to see a neurologist. So I didn't know that about medication overuse, and I then realised that they had helped for some time, but they'd actually stopped working, and I was taking them in line with the prescription and the guidance there, but that doesn't account for medication overuse headache. And so when I learnt about that, I just went cold turkey with them. They weren't doing anything anyway. I just stopped taking them immediately. So that's kind of the medical support I received. Because I was aware that my greatest need was for support, for the first time in my entire life, I asked him, it was a male neurologist, what support is available to me? And he said, there is none. And that was brutal. Even to say it now, it's just, It was like devastating, 20-year journey, believing to get there, and then to be told there is none, there is no support, help is not coming. It was a really, really difficult season in my life, but also at least I understood that my needs could not be met by this service. So that left me with seeking out other ways to meet my needs.
There's a few things in this which are really important. So the first one is the not sympathetic to phrasing, because telling you about medication overuse as a contributing factor is a useful thing to be told. Somebody told you something helpful, but not sympathetic to is an interesting way of putting things, isn't it? Because, as you say, migraine is often poorly understood and poorly treated. It doesn't fit into the things that people feel their field is, and so people fall through the cracks. But then there's something in this as well about ambiguity in communication, both from your GP, who sounds like they were trying their best, because I think not sympathetic to is like a polite way of saying they're probably not going to be very helpful. But as you say, you interpret that as, I don't need sympathy, I need support. And if they said they're probably not going to be very supportive, that would be a better way of putting it. But it doesn't fit in that way that professionals talk about each other and try not to be critical of each other, which I think is valid. You don't want to set up an appointment with someone where they feel like they're going into something that's not going to be helpful in the beginning. But then there's that role of ambiguity in communication where actually you said, well, what support is available? What that neurologist probably could have said is, there's nothing I can do beyond what I've said.
I needed that. But it's like you shared before, the difficulty in saying that when there's all the bias and the training and the limitations. I would have been so thankful for that. That would have been really helpful.
Because from what you've told me and from what I've read and from our communications in the past, you have found things that helped, but you were told there is nothing, and a huge number of people take that message on board. And so rather than saying there is nothing, sorry, this particular specialist, this particular service, this particular speciality has a very limited capacity to offer you support, is a very different conversation to saying there is nothing. And to say there is nothing, if someone gets written off by one clinician, there is a huge amount of power in that, and there's a huge amount of potential negative consequences to that. One of the things that I think is really key when it comes to supporting people who are living with long-term conditions is to leave some space, not for being unrealistic, not for getting your hopes up in a way which is going to be unhelpful, but leaving a bit of space for them to go and work it out themselves, or for somebody who isn't you to support them.
What happened was, when I was leaving, the neurologist said, I'll see you in 6 months, but more likely 7 with the way the NHS is at the moment. And that's when I went off and really dug deeper into the research, and I'd started hearing things like, if you cut gluten out, that can really help. And I asked about that in my appointment. I said, I've heard that cutting gluten out can help. Are there any dietary changes I can make? And he said, I wouldn't bother. Luckily, I went away with that insight and was just determined to find the support that I needed, which did lead to joining a chronic migraine Facebook group. Unfortunately, it didn't feel very supportive. I could feel everyone's pain and it was too much, so I didn't stay in there very long. But one of the first resources that I came across was the book The Migraine Miracle, which talked all about inflammation in our diet, what our ancestors ate, and broke it down. It didn't say, right, overhaul your whole diet, cut out fat, do this, calorie cut, it was, right, cut out gluten and sugar, then do this. And even cutting out gluten and sugar, that's massive. I chose one at a time, embedded that first, and then moved on to the next change. In that time, those 7 months, I also came across the Migraine World Summit, and it was my wish that these people could share with their patients exactly what you've said. We appreciate and understand the time limitations. The pressures are enormous. The systems that we have in place are unsustainable. And no one person or one thing or one system can meet the needs of everyone. That's just ludicrous when we really think about it. And that was my one wish, that patients could be empowered with a link, a book, a resource, a sheet with a few things on. And that was what I went back to him with. When I went back, I'd managed to break the chronic pain cycle. I was left with 2 severe attacks a month that were wiping me out over 2 weeks of the month, menstrual migraine attacks they were. I was still losing 2.5 weeks a month, but I'd managed to break the chronic pain cycle. In its place, that left chronic fatigue. So when I went back, I was still very chronically unwell, but it was a hell of a cycle to break, especially in such a short period of time. So that was the one which I left him with, was please share this book, this Migraine World Summit link with people. That's how I left that. But I do want to speak to the support side of things, because very painful lesson here. It's been very painful to learn this. It felt like at one time that I wasn't receiving support from anyone, from anywhere, because my support needs were so great and I'd left them unmet for such a long time, arguably, probably all of my life. It was very difficult to see what support I was receiving and what kind I needed and how many different types there were and who was helping with this but wasn't necessarily adept at helping with the other. So that kind of expectation that we have on our romantic partners, for example, I was wanting my boyfriend, not very aware of this. I couldn't communicate this or appreciate this back then. I was wanting him to be my emotional support as well as my practical support, as well as, I could sit down with my finances and speak to him about financial things. The frustration I felt that he couldn't help me with everything and be that person to help with everything without having the level of insight and understanding and appreciation that these are the areas he's helping me with and supporting me with. These are the areas he isn't, but they're not necessarily his strong points. These areas of support I can seek somewhere else. So yeah, I really wanted to speak to that because that's so important. We've got physical support, practical support, help with moving house, help with food shopping and meal prepping or cleaning. Then we've got mental health support, therapy, a counsellor, time in nature, spending time with friends, exercise. And then we've got emotional support, which I had no eye on at all. And also I've come to understand spiritual. These are 5 pillars of health. So the physical pillar of health, mental pillar of health, emotional pillar of health, spiritual pillar of health, and financial. We really need to be bringing this into the conversation. These are all, as I've come to understand it, areas of our health and needs that we have. And within that, various elements of support.
I often ask people, do you feel that your support network is able to support you emotionally, practically, and socially? And the emotional side of things, I would say, is the mental health side of things. It's who can I talk to when I'm feeling bad? And do I feel genuinely heard? And do I feel genuinely understood? And do I feel that my needs are being met in a variety of ways? And then the practical support is exactly what you said. It's who can help with the chores. The social supports, who do I enjoy spending time with? And the first 2 might not necessarily be the third. And the spiritual side for me is who alleviates suffering, who makes me feel enrichment, who makes me feel that I'm living my values. I think you're right. Not everyone can play that role. And there's a really, really difficult element here that some people do want very small social circles and the catch-all idea that everybody needs a village. I think not everybody needs a village. I think an awful lot of people have persuaded themselves that they don't need a village because it's fine. We've now got our phones to constantly distract us. But there's something else I wanted to revisit about struggling to recognize and communicate your needs, because people just expect, it's what you said before, you were expecting, I think, your partner at the time to just know what you needed, and they don't. I just wanted him to
scoop me up. I'll take care of everything. You just do what you need to do. Get yourself well. I'll pay for everything. Don't worry about it. But could I express that to him? Could I let him know that? Could I heck? Just expected him to be a mind reader and to be able to see the struggle without sharing what was really going on for me and what I was thinking. and how I was feeling.
Comes back to the invisible illness and a lot of the things that you've said a bit earlier in the conversation about shielding everyone, trying to maintain things, putting on a show of how well you were doing. All of that stuff makes it even harder for someone to read your mind.
And that was the impression I was given. This woman has it all together. She's really happy. She knows what she's doing. Look at her amazing life. She's so successful. That was exactly the performance. That was absolutely the image that I was portraying, which obviously I couldn't see at the time, but I can now.
This is something that you see over and over again, is people desperately clinging on. And it goes back to what we were talking about before to do with grief. It goes back to the fact that it feels easier to cling on to your old life than it is to begin recognizing that things have changed and therefore you need to make a change. And actually that making of a change often is the first step to begin to start putting things back together again. There's this idea in acceptance and commitment therapy about dropping the struggle, that actually trying to pretend that nothing's different is one of the barriers to you being able to move forward.
Yeah.
And I think pretending to everyone that you're fine is a pretty strong guarantee that no one's going to be able to support you.
100%. I can see that in ways that I absolutely couldn't before.
Are there any things that you haven't mentioned that you feel were particularly useful in terms of how you have come to the point where you feel that things are much more manageable now?
There's the 5 pillars of health, so I've connected with those that we all see very differently. We just talk about them for, I've just speak to them for context really to get the conversation going. But I've also realised that it's felt like there are different pathways, but they're all very connected and interlinked, and they're not a straight line with a beginning and an end. They're more like a bloody mountain climb. In fact, one of them feels more like you're tossed out at sea and you're in the middle of the ocean and the storms are relentless and there's no one there with a lifeboat. But what I've come to understand those as are survival, which was spoken to, found ways to survive. I expressed my need and spoke to someone. I'll let them know how I was feeling. That enabled me to bring in some support with the counselling therapy. And learning to build my base, which was like about bringing in the support and understanding that we have physical needs as well as mental needs, emotional, spiritual and financial. And a couple of years in, so 2016 was the breakdown, counselling. 2018 was the full collapse of my life and like really trying to find my ground and my feet and all of that. 20, I embarked on like more of a healing journey, the deeper end of the healing journey. I started having trauma healing therapy, body work. I had that every month for 6 years, and I'm very aware of the privilege that's involved in bringing in the support and deepening the kind of journey to the extent that I did. I had a house that I could sell, and I sold that to move into a caravan to gift me a life living without the enormous pressure of having a mortgage or any rent. I inadvertently opened up a dream way of being, life gifting me more freedom than I'd previously known or experienced or was even aware of that I had. And that really opened up the possibility and opportunity to not just connect with my dreams, because I'd already been doing that, but to really follow them and really go after them. And one of those was to become a writer. And that pathway kind of opened up the opportunity to not just survive, not just, find my ground and build my base around me, but to rise with it and thrive.
You've mentioned a couple of times that financial is one of the core elements, and I think that's so true. And it's something that's missing from so many of these conversations, is that actually if somebody's life isn't able to accommodate them being able to move forward, then really we need to try and figure out how to help to address that, or we're just wasting everyone's time. There are 2 tiers of pain management. There's the stuff which helps a bit and there's nothing wrong with it. The stuff which is maybe distracting to your nervous system or a pleasant sensation to your nervous system. And then there's the stuff that actually re-regulates your systems. And the stuff that actually re-regulates your systems, if there's a barrier in your life which is stopping you from doing that, then I think there's a potential that you're going to really struggle to see any significant improvement. And obviously that's really complicated because there's all sorts of things that are potential barriers in people's lives, and there are all sorts of reasons why those barriers are maintained, and it's important for people to maintain them. You used the word privilege before, and there is something here which is beginning to really influence my thinking on all of these things, is how much does recovery have to do with the privilege to be able to maybe self-fund something, or the ability to be able to find a path? And that's something that I'm really struggling with in my own practice at the moment, is how much of this stuff is the stuff that's really important? How much is effective pain management work actually to do with trying to improve society and improve people's financial situations? Looking at people's symptoms is a pretty surefire way of ensuring that you're not really doing the best work that you can, because it's often the secondary consequences that are more important, and it's often the drivers that are more important. But when those drivers are someone's socioeconomic situation, that's a really tricky thing. And a lot of clinicians see that as being nothing to do with them.
It's everything to do with them, and we've got to start having this conversation, haven't we? Like you say, I've written about it significantly in my book, and I think I've stumbled upon why we're not having this conversation as openly, or writing about it or speaking to it. It's damn hard. It's very, very hard, I have to say. Right, and this is speaking from a place of immense privilege. I'm sitting down with the chapters and writing about the financial element. It was probably, if not the hardest, one of the hardest, the chunk in the pathway for rebuilding your base.
Yes, because it is. You've hit the nail on the head. It is really uncomfortable and really hard to have these particular conversations, and to recognize our complete impotence in the face of it sometimes. There are all sorts of factors and barriers that keep people trapped in situations, and we don't have the support in place, we don't have the belief in place, we don't have the empathy in place to be able to genuinely support people, to hopefully create conditions that improve their situation a lot of the time. And so people have to do it on their own, and I think some people are in situations which are unable to facilitate that, and then it's about how do we support those people.
Absolutely. And privilege is complex too. Privilege is complex because we immediately go to material privilege, financial privilege, but what of our spiritual privilege, and what of the privilege of being alive? To be alive is a privilege. To even have access to medication and a diagnosis is a privilege that a lot of people in the world still don't have. It's very complex. I have to sit in the dark with it for in the way that I have, to the extent that I have. I've come to realise that privilege is what makes this possible. It damn well doesn't make it any easier. It doesn't make it any easier or more supported or understood, but it absolutely makes where I've come from to where I am today a possibility.
Yeah, privilege is too locked into a lot of the time the financial, the economic considerations, but actually having a really conscientious and considerate support network is a privilege. So it's not just, do you have enough money to be able to figure this out? It's also to do with, do you have the environmental factors to be able to try and figure this out? Do you have the potential upbringing that is helped to contribute to how you try and work these things out? How we then try and help other people to gain that is an interesting and challenging thing, certainly.
It really is.
Amber, is there anything that you haven't said that you really feel would be helpful to share?
Intuitively, I'm drawn to hope. I often look at hope as being quite rebellious, but also a grounded hope. Not just fobbing ourselves off with hope or pretentious hope, but grounded kind of rebellious hope. Opening up to possibility. We've just been speaking about privilege making this a possibility, and it can feel like there's no hope whatsoever. We might have even been told that as well. Data and statistics show that the chance of recovery is very slim. A lot of this journey of exploration is about venturing into the unknown, and of course that can be terrifying. But for me, I reached a point where, well, the known is an absolute guaranteed no-no. I've been told that, I've read that, I understand that. I've absolutely got no chance of recovery. Maybe when I've experienced menopause, with it being migraine specifically, and that having such strong links to hormones. Maybe, if I'm lucky, I was 38 at the time. Menopause felt like a long time away. And the path, at one time back in 2018, at the full collapse of my life, I was literally sat in my living room with personal independence payment forms in one hand, understanding that the chances were I was going to get rejected for my case, not just once or twice, but repeatedly. So that was very much one path, and it felt like there was a guarantee that I wouldn't get better with that path. And then it felt like there was another path, and it was the path that I'd already found myself on, this journey of research and understanding that change was needed. So I'd already started making the little teeny tiny changes, one change at a time, and embedding them in before I moved on to the next change. And it felt like, oh, I can try this path, I might get better. And it really felt like that was the one that came with hope. And I've since come to understand that hope is a healing path. I'm not suggesting we make those choices necessarily. I'm just sharing, that aspect of my story and how it presented and what it looked like for me in that moment. But yeah, grounded, rebellious hope.
Absolutely love that. The kind of radical but grounded hope, because there is so much toxic positivity in wellness. And I often refer to it as cautious optimism. And something that you said before about cumulative changes is trial and it's error. But if we're not open to possibility, if we're not open to trying, if we're not open to hope, then where do we go? There are two paths. You stay in the known path, which has not helped you, or you go and explore something else. And this is where a trap can be, is when people get stuck in the rage, the frustration, the distress of no one's coming to save me, but they don't go, so what now? That so what now is so important. And that doesn't mean that we just say everything's going to be fine. This toxic positivity is as damaging as embedded hopelessness, but it does have to be radical. It does have to be grounded. Nothing's going to happen without that openness to possibility. That's a really core way of summarizing a huge amount of what's been said today.
Yeah, and just to speak to that moment between realising and recognising that no one's coming to your rescue and having to be the one to find another way. It speaks to a particularly dark day that I experienced again back in 2018. I'd spent so long wishing, like I mentioned earlier, for my boyfriend to sweep me up in his arms and tell me that everything was going to be all right and he would take care of everything, while I then, for the first time in my life, tended to myself and my needs without having anything externally to worry about. I remembered about the book The Secret, where she said everything within your reality is born of your own creation, and how difficult and uncomfortable that can be to sit with that.
Yeah, that's sitting with discomfort. The choices that I've made have contributed to my stress, and the choices that I make can get me hopefully out of this situation. That stuff happens to someone else. I don't need to worry about sick pay because I'm healthy. I don't need to worry about paying my mortgage because nothing's ever going to happen to me to stop me being able to pay my mortgage. And sitting with discomfort and taking responsibility are common denominators over and over and over again in the conversations, but they're really unpleasant realizations and they make people feel attacked. If you don't utterly, cautiously, at the right time, in the right way, communicate that to someone, then you've potentially annihilated your therapeutic relationship with them.
Oh, goodness me, yeah.
The big criticism of any approach that is talking about this stuff is that people say, well, I don't like that that's being said about the approach that I've taken. And it does seem to be a bit of a significant difference in the people who do consistently report getting better. And as we've discussed, there are all sorts of contributing factors. There are all sorts of privileges. There are all sorts of things that align perfectly. And so the big challenge is trying to support people to realize the discomfort and the responsibility while simultaneously not making them feel worse. That is incredibly challenging. Recognizing that not everybody can be that person is important in that, because people aren't necessarily ready for that. they're not ready for that process. But also you might just not be the right person to have that conversation with them. So I think that's a really important thing for clinicians.
There's so much nuance. Yes, I have written this book, but I've been very conscious and aware not to write it. This is how I've done it, so this is how you do it. There's 5 pathways, there's 5 steps. It's an invitational book and set of pathways, and well, there's a lot of intentions I've kind of implanted and seeded into this book, but one of them is that we start a conversation about it and start looking at our health through a different lens and different perspective, which means stepping back and widening the picture and looking at the picture in the same way that it'd be nice if we start doing that with our bodies as well, as a whole, and not as kind of separate things here and there.
Yeah. There's a big difference between being willing to try things and them not working and being open to possibility, and to what you said before, this worked for me, therefore it'll work for everyone. And that's where so often we go wrong. If someone doesn't respond to something, then they're potentially for the scrap heap, but actually it's maybe that they need a wider holistic approach where we look at the whole person and how they're embedded within their world is always going to be more important than going, well, it hurts here, so we need to look there. That's the only thing that we're looking at, and that's the only thing that we've got time for. Thank you so much, Amber, for talking to me today. It's been a real pleasure to speak to you and to hear your thoughts, your insights, and your learning. If what Amber has shared today has resonated with you, then I'll leave ways to connect with her in the show notes. You've been listening to the Conditions for Recovery podcast. I'll see you in the next one.